I became an itinerant artist. I was an artist right from the beginning, since childhood. I was encouraged by my parents. But I was an itinerant, before I was an itinerant artist, I was an itinerant antique dealer. My dad was an old New England antique dealer, and I traveled around New England with him buying out of old estates. So I went from being an itinerant antique dealer throughout New England and meeting a lot of people. That's how I started to get a base for my later career as an itinerant artist. I met a lot of people, and I was very young at the time. I was just back from Europe. I'd lived in Europe for 2 years, and I made a lot of contacts. I was precocious, and I started buying antiques and mainly paintings. So it was a great area when I went from being an antique dealer into becoming an itinerant artist. Slowly people asked me to do these things because they saw what I'd done, and it was clever. And it was ahead of the whole curve with interior decorating period interior houses. There wasn't much knowledge about it in those days. And because I was with my dad and I saw a lot of folk art and a lot of old houses, I was ahead of the curve on it. So people started asking me, and year-wise, that was in the middle 60s to the later 60s, I started actually working in people's houses for hire. The itinerant was almost a personification of a certain type of New Englander, or particularly an American. Very democratic, very entrepreneurial, very self-motivated. And there wasn't a clear line for people like Rufus Porter. There was lots of itinerants. We apply the term itinerant artist. But in the 19th century, the idea of itinerant was very broad. It's an ancient tradition. It goes way back in history. There's always been people on the road that people looked for when they came, whether they were ministers, traveling musicians, medics. There was all different types of people that traveled the roads. There was no other medium. The newspapers weren't even very prominent out in the country at the time. So these guys brought new ideas to these little New England towns, as well as selling something. Many of them were part of early Protestant sects. We've well known that quite a few of them were proponents of these sects that were developing in New England, and they talk to people about that as well as politics. The thing that makes me feel really committed to this subject more than just as a way of making a living is that by being part of it and living this kind of a life, I've understood a lot from me personally. This is the education that I've got. I left home at a young age and started traveling. And I see a lot, I feel it, I see a lot through the eyes of the old-time people, how, we advance by our own efforts. It's a window into the past, which is not necessarily covered by most historians. There's some that do, like Nina Little or Thomas Flexner, to name a couple. But my perception of the past is very different in a lot of ways than other people. I mean, I see how the country has changed, and I've identified with it a lot, and I'm hoping to work on a book on the subject, comparing my own career in it with the old-timers.
You've been at this work for a good many years. You must have done many, many walls, and all over New England or further?
I've worked as far away professionally as, well, if you want to consider when I was young, I did murals in taverns on the Greek islands. But since I've been in America and had a family, I've worked in Texas for the famous Hunt family. I worked in Chicago, the famous Granger family. I've worked in London, worked in Ladbroke Square, did a house in Ladbroke Square, worked in Switzerland, but mostly it's New England. I'm really a New Englander, and my roots are here, and even though I was affected a lot by modern art as a younger person, as you'll see that in my work. I'm grateful for that because that's what takes it out of just, it's part of me. It's what I've brought to the itinerant tradition is a modern conception. Even though I work with the techniques of the 19th century, I'm a modernist in that way. I don't, when I approach a painting, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm talking about the freestanding paintings that are on the wall. But first, before I got to that, the paintings are very much about environment. Whether they happen to be murals or whether they happen to be patterning on the walls or coloring the walls or floors or whatever, to me it's always a question of making an environment for the people to live in. It's not pictorial. Even my murals, I don't think of them as pictures on the wall. I think of them more in terms of an environment where people can live in. I can't leave out the fact that I always work with other people. Almost always I've worked with other people. I enjoy the give and take of doing a project with another person. Kevin has been with me, and Kevin had a lot to do with the movement from the artwork on the walls to freestanding. He had a lot to do with that because he always wanted to get back to the studio, whereas I've always liked the give and take of being in people's houses and talking with people. Kevin preferred the artistic process to be more private, like in a studio, and he was always looking for a way to do that. And we discovered this idea of plastering on foam and making the paintings at the beginning were very fragmented. The first shows were called fragments. One of the pleasures of what I do is introducing it to other people, and Kevin's a lot younger than I am. And I really have always hoped that we would start a sort of a school, not in the formal sense of a school, but inspire other people, young artists, to look at some of these traditions and start to rebuild. As modern art was a breaking down of old traditions with a modernistic point of view, I feel we've reached a point where now we want to rebuild the traditions back, or at least to work from them, not a copyist. I'm not talking about copying anything. I'm talking about the spirit of the classicism and spirit of the old timers to reintroduce this into contemporary art. And I would be delighted if people would find that in my work and would start, other artists would start to work that way. And one of the reasons I do these interviews, I've done these interviews with Gino particularly a number of times, is that I like to get that consciousness out there, as well as people to know me and come to me professionally. Of course, that's always a consideration. But also that for them to think on the subject and see how it applies to them in their everyday life. Yes, I'd love to see this go out more and reach more people.